Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Welcome. I'm Michael Green. I'm Senior Vice President for Asia and the Japan Chair at CSIS and a Professor and Director of Asian Studies at Georgetown University in Washington. I want to welcome you on behalf of CSIS and our partners, the Japan Institute for International Affairs, JIIA, to the 27th Annual U.S.-Japan Security Seminar. We're going to conduct our discussion today in English, but we're providing you simultaneous interpretation into Japanese if you need it. And you'll find that interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen if you want to use it. This U.S.-Japan Security Seminar has been meeting since 1994. I actually went to the first one as a graduate student, and it has served as an annual checkup on the security relationship through hard times and good times, an opportunity for experts on both sides to compare notes, to assess the security environment around them, to start forming an agenda for the next year and the next decade, involving former officials, scholars, current officials, and military officers. Last month, we met with a closed group session, including government and outside experts to brainstorm. And we want to bring you some of that discussion today with our expert panel. But before we do, I would invite you to view a video greeting from Japan's Foreign Minister, Toshimitsu Motegi, which he prepared for us a few weeks ago for the closed session. The greeting's in Japanese, and you will be able to see it with English subtitles.
CSIS と日本国際問題研究所による日米安保セミナーは多くの関係者のご尽力で今年27回目の開催となりますが、今年のセミナーは特に2つの観点から重要な意義があると考えています。第一に、米国でバイデン政権の誕生直後という極めてタイムリーなタイミングでこのセミナーが開催をされることです。日米同盟は日本外交の基軸です。そして今や日米同盟の意義は二国間関係にとどまりません。日米同盟は米国でも超党派の力強い支持を得ており、私はバイデン政権とともに日米同盟の一層の強化に取り組む考えです。第2に、100年に一度と言われるパンデミックにより、冷戦後進行してきた国際社会の変化と動揺が一気に顕在化しているということです。新型コロナにより国際社会は甚大な影響を受けました。また、法の支配よりも力による支配が実体化する傾向が強まり、自由主義より権威主義の方が新型コロナにうまく対応しているのではないかという見方さえあります。各国間の競争と対立の激化を抑制しつつ、国際社会との協調強化に向け、日本と米国には今まで以上に重要な使命が課されています。このような中、私は今後の日米同盟のさらなる強化にあたり、次の3つの視点が重要だと考えています。第一に、中国による透明性を欠いた軍事力の強化、東シナ海における一方的な現状変更の試み、北朝鮮の核・ミサイル開発など、日本周辺の安全保障環境がさらに厳しさを増す中で、日米同盟の抑止力と対処力を一層強化することです。最新の技術革新も踏まえ、宇宙やサイバーといった新たな領域、経済安全保障も含め、創造的、柔軟かつ力強い発想で日米の役割分担を検討していきたいと思います。第2に、日米同盟を核としてインド太平洋地域において実効的な 同志国間のネットワークを構築していく必要があります。昨年10月の日米豪印外相会談では、海洋安全保障、質の高いインフラをはじめ、さまざまな分野で実践的な協力を進めていくことで一致しました。自由で開かれたインド太平洋の力強い推進者である日米豪印に加え、ASEAN、欧州、さらには中東アフリカでも法の支配に基づく自由で開かれた国際秩序を構築していくことの重要性が共有されています。私自身、昨年の夏以降、これらの国々を歴訪していますが、このビジョンを共有する国々と連携を強化し、その実現に向けた協力を具体化していきたいと思います。第3に、次の時代を見据え、新型コロナ対策、気候変動、自由貿易体制の確立やデジタル分野での新たなルール作りをはじめ、ポストコロナの国際秩序づくりでも、日本とバイデン政権が緊密に連携して国際社会で指導力を発揮していくことが求められています。昨年はこのセミナーにもご縁のあるエズラ・ボーゲル名誉教授と岡本幸夫さんがお亡くなりになりました。日米関係にとって大きな損失ですが、お二人の情熱と意志をしっかりと引き継ぎながら、日米同盟を一層強化していきたいと思います。今回のセミナーが実り多きものとなることをお祈りし、私のメッセージといたします。
Thank you to the Foreign Ministry and Ambassador Motegi for those framing remarks. I will come back to his three agenda items of deterrence, networking, diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific, and then U.S.-Japan cooperation on trade, climate change, digital technology with our panelists in a moment. But I'm very pleased that we have joining us in real time from the Department of State, the Acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific, Ambassador Song Kim. Ambassador Kim was confirmed by the Senate as ambassador to Indonesia last summer. Before that, served with great distinction in the Philippines as a senior negotiator on North Korea. I think we first met when Song was in the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, covering political affairs. So we're delighted to have joining us for some framing remarks from the U.S. side by Ambassador Song Kim.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Green. Delighted to join you and one of Japan's most distinguished diplomats, Ambassador Sasae. Good morning to everyone. Thank you to CSIS and the Japan Institute of International Affairs for hosting this valuable discussion. Last year, we marked the 60th anniversary of our two countries signing the Treaty of Cooperation and Mutual Defense. Over these 6 decades, the U.S.-Japan alliance has been the cornerstone of peace, security, and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. There is no doubt that it will continue to be for generations to come. When President Biden outlined his vision for America's place in the world during a speech at the State Department last month, the role of the U.S.-Japan alliance will play couldn't be more clear. Diplomacy is back at the center of our foreign policy. We will strengthen our alliances and engagement with the world, not to meet yesterday's challenges, but those of today and tomorrow. Leading with diplomacy means standing shoulder to shoulder with our key allies and partners once again. In just first 7 days of this administration, President Biden spoke with Prime Minister Suga, and Secretary Blinken spoke with Foreign Minister Motegi mere hours after being sworn in as Secretary. The importance of the U.S.-Japan alliance to the United States is clear. The President stressed the need for diplomacy rooted in defending freedom, championing opportunity, upholding universal rights, respecting the rule of law, and treating every person with dignity. All fundamental values we share with Japan. He also made clear that we would directly take on the challenges posed to our prosperity, security, and democratic values by our competitors. We will compete with China from a position of strength by working with our allies and partners and through meaningful participation in multilateral arena. And few security relationships are as consequential as the US-Japan alliance. Japan hosts approximately 55,000 US service members, the largest contingent of US forces anywhere outside of the United States. The US 7th Fleet is headquartered in Yokosuka, which serves as the home port of the USS Ronald Reagan, the Navy's only forward deployed aircraft carrier. On February 24th, Foreign Minister Motegi and the US Embassy Charge Young signed a one-year extension of the current US-Japan host nation support agreement. We will continue negotiations on a multi-year agreement, focusing on strengthening the alliance to meet the security challenges of today and the future. Our commitment to Japan's security is absolute. The United States affirms the Senkaku Islands are covered by Article 5 of the US-Japan Security Treaty, and we remain opposed to any unilateral attempts to change the status quo in the East China Sea. We stand firmly behind this commitment. The Biden-Harris administration is committed to strengthening America's relationships not only with our allies, but the relationships among them. None are more important than Japan and the Republic of Korea. We will explore opportunities to expand our cooperation in areas such as tackling COVID-19 and addressing climate change, and are working together to reinvigorate trilateral cooperation on the North Korea challenge. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, the United States, Japan, and the Republic of Korea held our first trilateral meeting under this administration to exchange views on shared challenges and discuss the ongoing US-DPRK policy review. During this productive discussion, we stressed the importance of continued close coordination and expressed our continued commitment to complete denuclearization and peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. The United States and Japan are also working closely together with India and Australia through the Quad. Secretary Blinken and the other Quad foreign ministers met on February 18th and committed to meeting at least annually at the ministerial level and on a more regular basis at senior and working levels to strengthen cooperation on advancing a free and open Indo-Pacific region. In closing, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on the unbreakable bond of the American and Japanese people. We're only days away from the 10th anniversary of the Great East Japan earthquake. In the face of great tragedy, our two countries carried out unparalleled search, rescue, and recovery efforts. At the peak of Operation Tomodachi, the Department of Defense had 24,000 personnel, 190 aircraft, and 24 Navy ships supporting humanitarian assistance and disaster relief efforts, evidence of our enduring commitment and bond with the people of Japan. We are proud to have stood together in the aftermath of that tragic disaster. The United States and Japan will continue to stand strong together in the face of any adversity to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed to Ambassador Sung Kim for giving us some very helpful framing remarks as well for our panel discussion and for service in the State Department at this really exciting time in the Alliance. I'm going to turn now to the panel. Let me first introduce them to you, although you probably know them all. Ambassador Kenichiro Sasae was the former ambassador from Japan to the United States and Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, is now president of JIIA. Mireya Solis is the director for the Center for East Asian Policy Studies and the Philip Knight Chair in Japan Studies at the Brookings Institution. And Tetsuo Kotani is a widely recognized expert on maritime security and defense policy and a senior fellow at JIIA. We're going to have a tight-on, a conversation among the panelists, and then we'll turn to audience questions. You can ask your questions if you're in the audience through the CSIS website for this event. We've already started collecting some very interesting, and I have to warn the panelists, some very difficult questions from the audience. Let me ask each of you, you know, when I first went to Japan, when I first started studying Japan, Ambassador Mike Mansfield said the US-Japan alliance, the US-Japan relationship is the most important in the world, bar none. And the US Embassy started wearing t-shirts that said the bar none ranch. And it was kind of the accepted wisdom. But then in the 90s, observers like Yoichi Funabashi said, we're in the era of alliance drift with the Cold War over. When I was in the White House working for President Bush and Prime Minister Koizumi was in charge in Japan, it was the era of Elvis Presley. I'd be interested, just since there's so much experience and historical knowledge on the panel, I'd be interested in how each of you would briefly characterize where we are right now in our bilateral relationship. And if you want to come up with a catchphrase, like most important in the world, bar none, this is, please feel free to. But let me start with you, Ambassador Sasae. Where are we right now in historical context in our relationship?
I think historical context, I think we are now in the moment of a real test of the alliance. As you said, Mike, back in 1960s or 70s, I think people were talking about this bar none stuff, and even talking about the equal global partnership of thought. They were kind of some massaging to Japan supporters, even Japanese people willing to be partnering with the United States in full terms. But as we move on, and after getting over these trade frictions and facing all this after a Cold War period and drifting, the United States is losing some of the potential adversary of the Thor. So it's kind of a loosened period of the alliance of the Thor. But during all these years, I think there was a consistent effort to upgrade the security alliance. And, back in the 70s or 80s, I mean, it was started, but it was not full-fledged. And there was security law, in place and so forth. We tried to both ways of the Thor, but it's not still sufficient enough. But we have come a long way. But the point here is that after the Cold War, I think this challenge of China, North Korea continue to be more difficult. I think the real trigger of alliance operation facing all this contingency could be real. So in that sense, I think we have come to a very serious moment of testing the alliance. So I hope that we could go through. There'll be more challenges ahead. Our alliance will be really tested.
Thank you. So the moment of testing for the alliance. Mireya, how would you characterize where we are right now?
Thank you very much, Mike. And it's such a pleasure to be here for this US-Japan security seminar. My phrase would be Japan is an indispensable ally, but in a very different geopolitical context and with a very interesting redefinition of the division of labor among the allies. And by what I mean by this is quite simply that we're all trying to figure out the China challenge. And there's a geopolitical dimension to that, but there's also a geoeconomic dimension to that. And we're also trying to factor in the impact of these new emerging technologies, how they're going to affect the source of national competitiveness, how they're going to affect the nature of interstate competition, and what kind of rulemaking is possible so that we have a clear pathway ahead for us. So what really is most striking for me, Mike, looking at this, I've been in this business now for several years, is how there has been almost a reversal of roles between the United States and Japan when it comes to the economic statecraft and to how we address geoeconomics. And I can do a very quick run of these different dimensions. And what's striking is that Japan is now much more forward-leaning than the United States in many of these arenas, which is not anything that when you and I were in graduate school, we were expecting when Japan was this very passive, defensive actor in international trade. See how things have changed. When you think about infrastructure investment in the region, Japan really is a peer competitor of China with its quality infrastructure initiative. So the idea of providing capital to developing Asia in order to address their infrastructure gaps, Japan has been forward-leaning, and the United States is trying to team up with Japan and Australia with initiatives that we can do more to make them actually have more legs. When it comes to digital, again, Japan with its free data flow with trust has already done significant work in standard setting, in having these discipline standards adopted in the G7 and G20. And this is to the benefit of the United States as well. When it comes to trade, Mike, we just did a podcast on these issues. And usually we talk about this, and it's true, from a point of view of the United States being absent from the mega trade agreements. But we should not lose of the sight that Japan actually and the remaining 11 countries were able to sustain the standards on digital economy, on state-owned enterprises, competition policy, all these intellectual property protection that the United States fully agrees with. And actually it's to our benefit that these disciplines did not die out after the past administration walked out the door on the TPP. So again, that's making these standards stay alive and vibrant is very important. And lastly, on the question of supply chain resilience and security, which has of course become a very important topic, I think that Japan also has done quite a bit here, and we should not lose sight of the significant role that Japanese companies play in East Asian supply chains. They provide some of the most advanced components, production equipment in semiconductor, advanced chemicals. But there are also lessons that perhaps we can get to discuss today, time allows, on how Japan has tried to address over-dependence on China. For example, the rare metals situation where Japan actually significantly decreased its dependence on China without renouncing or without giving up on economic integration with China where it's profitable to do so. So in all these areas, I think that Japan is leaning forward and the United States is trying to catch up. And finally, I think that going back to Ambassador Sasae on a test, I agree there is a test in the sense that it's important now to move from a bilateral discussion between the US and Japan that the Trump administration favored to how we project forward, which is something that Minister Motegi was also addressing. So we should not be discussing a stage 2 US-Japan bilateral trade deal. We should be discussing how we can bring these standards to the region. How can the United States be part of the regional architecture?
Thank you, Mireya. Thank you for the plug for my podcast, which is also on the CSIS website. It's called the Asia Chessboard, and the current episode is with Dr. Solis about trade architecture and grand strategy in Asia. And we'll come back to some of those issues on this panel too. So it's a moment of testing for the alliance where Japan and the US have reversed roles, and Japan is now a much more proactive player. So we just need the last part of our description. And for that, Kotani-san, how would you characterize where we are right now in our alliance?
Okay, thanks, Mike. I would say we are now getting back to the origin of the alliance. Our alliance started during the Korean War, the regional crisis. And following that, we have established a division of labor called Spear and Shield. Japan basically provided the basis and the US provided the forces, but still US and Japan shared roles and missions to fight the Cold War. But after the Cold War is ended, we have expanded our geographical scope of the alliance, first to the Asia Pacific and now in the Indo-Pacific. But given the growing threat from China and North Korea, we now have to face the regional threats again. So in that sense, we are now getting back to the origin of the alliance. And just like Ambassador Sasae said, we are now tested by this real security challenge from the neighboring countries. And some people say we are now facing a new Cold War. And I'm not sure whether the new Cold War is a right term to describe our times. But at least we are now facing a competition between the democratic powers and authoritarian regimes. And we are, facing a real challenge between the two powers. So in that sense, we are now getting back to the origin, and the difference is, as Mireya stated, Japan is not the junior partner to the US anymore, and Japan needs to play a greater proactive role in the alliance to maintain peace and security in this region.
So you've just given Hollywood a great trilogy for the U.S.-Japan alliance in 2021. Part one, a moment of testing. The second movie would be Trading Places, a reversal of roles, and then the final movie would be Back to the Origin. It's a very Hollywood-like trilogy. I hope some producer is on our webinar listening, and I'm sure Ambassador Sasae will have a starring role in all three movies. I agree with all that. I would just tie this piece of our discussion to a close by saying, in historical perspective, not only is Japan indispensable, but I would argue that actually no other U.S. ally has as much, not only importance, but I would say as much influence on American strategy. If you look at all the key elements of what the U.S. is doing now, free and open Indo-Pacific, infrastructure financing, except for trade, which I'll come back to with Mireya, a lot of it was really initiated by Japan over the last few years. So this is a moment that historians may look back on and say, Britain had huge influence on American strategic thinking 100 years ago. If you ask at the beginning of the 21st century, what country has the most influence on American strategic thinking, it would probably be Japan. It's just that it's not quite as noticeable. Maybe Japanese diplomats are more humble and quiet. It's, however, very much, as Kotani-san said, back to the origin, free and open Indo-Pacific. That's a very American idea of maritime strategy, and Japan urging the U.S. to come back to TPP and multilateral trade. That's the essence of American economic strategy after World War II. So it's not that this is alien to the U.S. So it's a really fascinating period in history. Jumping to the present, if I could get just a minute, a quick round. I'll start with Mireya, but if you could sit down with Prime Minister Suga right now, what's one thing he should do to signal to the US and the world the urgency and importance of the alliance right now? And I'll ask Kotani-san and Ambassador Sasae what they would tell President Biden. Maybe they're listening.
So recovering academic, can I offer two?
Yeah,
very
sure.
briefly. Very briefly, I would say we need to rebuild confidence and credibility of the United States economic diplomacy. So I would say let's jump ahead with the digital diplomacy. I see this as a real opening. Just a couple of days ago, the United States Trade Representative released the presidential trade agenda. There's a lot of enforcement, China challenge there, but there's a piece there about a digital economy piece. And I would like to seize on that opportunity and think about the US-Japan bilateral agreement on digital as a springboard for a plurilateral agreement. The e-commerce negotiations on the WTO are not going well because China is resisting some of these data flow provisions. So that would be my way in which you build a doable, realistic agenda to bring the United States, and Japan can be spearheading this as it already has a lot of mileage behind this. My second piece, very briefly, Mike, and I would say this to President Biden, it was there, but domestic measures, reassurance. We need that these countries are not going to be inward looking because of the COVID crisis. And therefore that Prime Minister Suga can longevity of, given that he faces dropping levels of support, fighting COVID has taken a hit. And therefore, I think that the US side would like to know that they have a partner that can be there for a long while still.
That's good. We talked about this on our podcast a bit, but a digital trade agreement would be, I assume, a stepping stone or maybe a signal that more is to come, as you encouraged in your earlier comments, for broader rulemaking and multilateral trade agreements. I also think a digital trade agreement is going to have to start with Japan. It's going to be easier with Japan than with Europe. It's already becoming obvious. Europe will be critical, but Japan is sort of the easiest and most logical starting point. Okay, that's good advice. And it also, of course, fits with one of Prime Minister Suga's big theme, which is the digital economy. Sasae Taishi, what would you ask President Biden to do to send an early signal of the strength and urgency in our alliance? You're still on mute, Taishi.
Okay. One, I think the Biden's China policy I think it is true that there were some concerns that he might go back to old days, but it's becoming clear that now the time is different. So we appreciate it and welcome. The point is that you need to translate all this strong stance into actual operative strategy. For example, I mean, when you talk about democracy and human rights, it's good possibly for you to take up legal issues. I mean, but at the same time, this has to be placed in the context of Hong Kong. Hong Kong is gone already, or could we roll back? Or Taiwan, what would you do? Is Biden different from Trump? If so, in what way? I mean, so all these things are not necessarily clear. So what I want to see from Biden administration is that we know that there is a China review now going on. There has to be some comprehensive, not only short and medium term and tactical one, but also longer term perspective of what we are going to achieve. And there is a debate about how do you deal with a communist regime? This is old and new. And there was discussion the other day in the Tokyo Global Dialogue. I mean, you know, would the U.S. government follow Pompeo's, jingoistic attitude toward the communist governments? Because there are a lot of undemocratic governments around the world. Is China the exception? It could be exception to the extent that the impact is great. But so all this, we need to make sure that there will be proper long-term and short-term strategy. That's why we want to see from Biden administration. Of course, we'd like to have more discussion on North Korea, but we will talk about it later, possibly.
So some more concrete plans, strategies for implementing the principles that Japan now has confidence, or most Japanese, I suppose, have confidence, animate the Biden administration. Strategic competition, that much is clear. But how do you do it? Where do you do it? What's the plan?
Yeah. But the point here is that should the Japan role and the U.S. role completely the same in dealing with China? I think there could be some slight difference of the view, possibly how you would intervene in Chinese domestic, regime and governance and so forth. That also applied how you will deal with undemocratic countries like Myanmar and so forth.
Yeah.
And so I think in Asian setting, I think if people try to think that what will be the result of this pressuring around, there has to be a better result, constructive result, without really alienating all this bad regime. So I think the question is how you would approach. These need to be ironed out.
You know, it seems to me one concrete reason why the Biden administration needs to move from first principles to actually articulating in more detail its China strategy is the fact that you and many other partners in Asia continue quoting the Pompeo speech. They're not in charge anymore. So if you're still quoting the previous government strategy, it's something of an indication that the new administration probably needs to do a bit more to articulate what their strategy will be. A lot of people are still debating the Pompeo speech. We're also in a different political environment with the US, where the outgoing Secretary of State and National Security Advisor are giving lots of speeches on strategy right away. Usually our former cabinet members quietly go to write books and stay out of the limelight. But it is interesting how in Japan and Singapore and India, people are still debating the previous administration's strategy. And it's a sign that the Biden guys have got to come out and have some concrete demonstration of what their plan is.
Yeah, then that would also apply to U.S. policy towards Saudi Arabia or North Korea. How that democracy matter. That's a long-standing issue, but still, when you enunciate all this democratic value and defend the values, then you have to deal with how you would cope with non-democracy.
You're saying we have to be consistent.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah,
that's not fair. Good point. And since Japan has articulated democratic values more and more in the open Indo-Pacific, this really needs to be a dialogue with Japan about what we mean. Kotani-san, what would you advise to President Biden as a first move?
Yeah, following what Ambassador Sasae said, I would propose President Biden make a policy statement on the Indo-Pacific. We understand this administration is trying to focus on the Indo-Pacific, but at the same time, the administration is facing a resource allocation challenge. You know, the Middle Eastern situation is not stabilizing, and you have a problem in Europe. So we are not sure whether the Indo-Pacific can secure a sufficient resource. And also there's a competition between the foreign policy challenges and the domestic challenges. And unless the Biden administration settles down, we are not sure whether the Biden administration can exercise a proactive external policy. So we'd like to hear the President Biden that the Indo-Pacific region will be a priority theater, and the administration will invest sufficient money and energy into the region.
I think that's going to be very important. There are encouraging signs. I mean, within the National Security Council staff, there's only one regional focus that has a senior coordinator, and it's the Indo-Pacific under Kurt Campbell, our friend. So that's a good sign. And if you followed what my former colleague at CSIS, Kath Hicks, has been tweeting and saying, and also Secretary Austin, they're clearly telegraphing to the Pentagon and to the world that the Western Pacific, the China problem, will be their top priority. But you haven't heard from the president. The Secretary of State hasn't, highlighted that. So I think one of the things our friends in the Biden administration will find out is when it comes to alliances, you've never done enough, and there's certainly more they could do. I want to turn to Foreign Minister Motegi's agenda. He mentioned 3 items, quite concretely, for our alliance: deterrence, building a network of like-minded states in the Indo-Pacific, and then working together on trade, digital, which we touched on, the environment. Let me keep with you, Tetsuo Kotani-san, on deterrence. Motegi-san talked about cyberspace. Japan is clearly doing more than ever before in terms of creating jointness and interoperability with the US, recognizing the right of collective self-defense, more realistic exercises with the US, increasing defense spending. But you're starting to hear more and more voices of concern on the US side that the self-defense forces do not have enough ammunition, that the exercises are still generally, particularly for ground and air, battalion, squadron-sized exercises, not the kind of large-scale exercises we did with NATO or we do with Korea when we face a real imminent threat. In some, you know what I mean? The shape of the exercises still looks a little bit like it did 20 or 30 years ago. And there's still issues of, or questions about who would command in Japan in a crisis, command and control. So there are some deficits still in terms of deterrence on the Japanese side, which people tend to talk about what we have to do as an alliance to work better together. But I'd ask you on Motegi-san's point about deterrence, what does Japan have to do, in your view, to strengthen capabilities and deterrence within the alliance?
Well, thanks, Mike. As you stated, I think the command and control should be the priority one. And 2018 National Defense Program guidelines are talking about it, and this is homework for Japan. And I think the Japanese government will find a good solution to it sometime soon. And once we establish a joint operational commander, I think that will help the alliance work better. And the Japan and the United States is now increasing the cooperation in the new domains. For example, we have just made a MOU on the space cooperation, and the Japanese satellites will host the US sensors on those satellites. And the Japanese government is now considering joining the US initiative on the satellite constellation to increase the ISR in the space domain. So we are seeing lots of development in the new domains. But my primary concern is the missile threats coming from both China and North Korea. And the Japanese government is now implementing the Aegis Ashore afloat, because the Aegis Ashore plan didn't go well. But seems like this Aegis Ashore afloat will be a most expensive platform for the self-defense force. And we are still not sure how much we need to operate these new platforms. And that might have a negative impact on the other platforms which self-defense force needs to introduce. So I think the Japanese government needs to come up with a right answer to this Aegis Ashore afloat. Otherwise, we cannot spend sufficient money for the enhancement of our missile defense capabilities. We need a more capable interceptors. We have to come up with development of directed energy weapons, and we have to increase our ISR. So this Aegis Ashore issue needs to be resolved very quickly.
That's a really excellent point. If we are in a moment, as Ambassador Sasae said, of testing, we, the US and Japan, don't have the luxury of throwing a lot of money at problems to avoid hard political decisions. We need to be spending our money on real capability, I think is what you're saying. And a good point. Thank you. Ambassador Sasae, so Motegi-san, second point was a network, a free and open Indo-Pacific of countries. What do you think is next in that strategy? We have the Quad, but what do you think we have to do within the region and the world to build up our partnerships?
Well, first of all, let me say this. The Biden's conversation with the Prime Minister Suga was great, especially in terms of confirming and committing to advancing this free and open Indo-Pacific concept and approach. And this declaratory policy continues to be important in getting more support, not only from those countries within the region, like ASEAN, but also European nations. As you know, ASEAN continue to pursue this issue, the policy of centrality, independence, and neutrality. But within that framework, ASEAN is beginning to shift their focus more on the potential problems ahead. They're expressing their support, this free and open idea. But at the same time, we have to be careful that ASEAN doesn't want to be entangled with the Sino-American confrontation. They have a huge, distrust to China, while they continue to depend upon Chinese economic support and assistance program. In the meantime, they continue to have some concern, worried about the United States too, in terms of their domestic, kind of divide of the thought. And they have, although they depend upon American presence and security. So all this, dilemma exists in ASEAN. But I think the important point is that as China would move and expand and increase the influence, ASEAN need to come to grips with the reality. So for that, we continue to need to upgrade ASEAN's capacity to counter, especially maritime domain of the Chinese sort of expansion. On the European side, as you know, there are more interest beyond the economic interest. About China, there are more strategic interest and concern. And the UK, France, Dutch, Netherlands, Germany, NATO, EU is now working on. So all these putting together, we could marshal more of the support from outside. But I think as you said, the Quad is the core of this exercise in terms of a strategic imperative and those values shared together, and the capacity. I'm pretty optimistic about this institutionalizations of the process. There was some problem before, you know it, right? But the ministerial level, it was done well, you know, with the Biden administration. I think this will be stepping up into leaders level soon, hopefully. And if that would happen, there need to be some leaders positions about we are going after. But when it comes to the substance of this Quad, I mean, we all know that economic and development and non-traditional security issues. But now I think we are gradually, you know, talking about what the security is about in the region. And this is a kind of a sensitive issue. But I think in reality, this is no secret that we need to talk about China. So China is also aware of this one. They try to label this exercise as a NATO-type anti-Chinese gathering. But I think this is not the anti-Chinese gathering. This is a gathering to defend our core values, free and open democracy and rule of law. So to the extent that China would expand and threatening, and this Quad could be also changed and responsive. And so there should be some flexible response strategy to the future. And that's where I think we stand at this moment.
Thank you. There are a lot of questions in the queue about the Quad. So we'll come back to that if we have time in a minute. Mireya, the third basket introduced by Foreign Minister Motegi was trade and technology and climate. You touched on trade and technology with your proposal for a digital trade agreement, starting with Japan and plurilateralizing. Could you touch on climate? I don't know how much you follow climate, but you know, you've seen the stories, I'm sure. On the one hand, people say, well, the US can't work on climate change and compete with China. And you hear that from the right and the left, by the way. If you look at articles on the left, they say drop geopolitical competition to focus on climate. It's an existential threat. They're thinking about China. And then on the right, you have people saying how naive of the Biden administration to focus on climate change. They have to clear the decks and completely focus on geopolitical competition. I'm sure you agree we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can have geopolitical competition and climate change cooperation. But normally people talk about that in the US-China context. So what are your thoughts on, you know, how the US and Japan can maybe show that you can work on climate and geopolitical competition at the same time? How would you frame this issue for the US and Japan right now?
Thank you, Mike. Well, I would start with some general observations. One is that there's greater convergence. You know, the fact that Prime Minister Suga embraced the decarbonization of Japan brought Japan and the United States so much closer in terms of what are the priorities, both nationally, bilaterally, and globally. So I think that that puts us in a very good place to begin with. I also think that the Biden administration's very strong signal that they're committing back to multilateralism. It's very positive for Japan. Japan is a strong multilateralist. Japan is a middle power, and therefore I think it sees the benefit of engaging and not creating distance, becoming aloof from multilateral institutions. So the United States coming back to Paris is beneficial. The same is the case for the World Health Organization, and even ending the stalemate about the appointment of the Director General of the WTO. Again, this all speaks about greater possibilities for coordination and leveraging shared understandings between the United States and Japan on the global scene. I also think that when it comes to the transnational issues that, like tech, climate, and also trade, it's very important that we're now talking about allied coordination. And that's an important shift, Mike, because I think that we are coming out of an era of America first, where it was mostly a unilateral approach. And now we're talking about how can the United States reach understanding with its closest allies. And I know that the skeptics immediately come up with the difficulties of allied coordination. I would make the case that that's such a much better problem to have than to be dealing with the zigzagging and the unilateral takes that we were seeing from the past administration. Now, how do we get the nuts and bolts of this cooperation on technology, on trade, on climate that's critical to the success? It's not going to be easy. There are going to be some hard choices, whether, for example, Japan has really adopted the very ambitious climate goals. How is it going to be operationalized? Again, Prime Minister Suga faced a very difficult year, and therefore whether the long-term objectives can be met or not is a question that we have. How would that impact, for example, the fact that Japan has financed coal plants internationally? Is Japan going to then readjust that in very significant ways? All those things need to be addressed. But nevertheless, I do think that there is greater understanding, and this is my last point. When you talk about competition with China, we're not citing Pompeo anymore, as you said, because we're not framing this as an all-out zero-sum ideological contest. I think the United States, by signaling that it can be tough with China, but it can keep the door open to functional cooperation on climate when it's in the national interest of the United States, again, it speaks of convergence with what has been Japan's approach of course, competing with China, pushing back on East China Sea issues and so forth, but also acknowledging that there is a very vast degree of economic integration that cannot be denied. So again, I see a lot of the two countries coming together that does not guarantee smooth sailing on all fronts, but the principle, the first order principles are closer now than they were in the past.
That's a really good point. I'm personally going to keep an eye on coal. That was a real irritant in the Obama administration's approach to Japan on energy and climate. And we're going to have to manage that one carefully. There are arguments on both sides. I personally think that it's highly unlikely that Japan is going to suddenly stop doing coal. But as you pointed out, Prime Minister Suga has committed to a zero carbon economy in the future. So there's now a pathway, if you will, or a trajectory that aligns us more than before. That's a really good point. I have a question I'll direct to Ambassador Sasae about the Quad and about the United Kingdom, about Britain. It's a question from Britain, from our audiences all over the world, and I've received emails from members of Congress who are listening and others. So it's a very high power audience. But we have a question from the UK asking about Britain's role in the Quad. I like to remind people that the Quad idea was originally proposed by Commodore Matthew Perry in the 1850s. And he said someday, after he had opened Japan, he said someday the navies of the United States, Japan, and Britain will safeguard the Pacific Ocean. And he was 150 years early. But if you replace Britain with India and Australia, you get the Quad. But I guess the Royal Navy has a case for being in the Quad if it's a maritime alignment. But in general, Ambassador, how do you think about the Quad? Should we make it a quint or a sept, or should we let other like-minded allies plug in on a la carte, case by case? How would you design that architecture?
Yeah, I think for the moment, my preference is to concentrate on the deepening of Quads and Quad itself, because this the security component, we are talking about it, but how do we get this operationalized among the Quad still need to go. But in doing so, a country like UK, which has a great interest and capacity to deploy, and if they would like to be a part of that, there is no reason for us to say no. But the process-wise, I think it might be good for a country like Britain to start as an observer rather than trying to be a full membership. Like we, Japan, are observer to NATO of the sort. But this Quad is not a NATO, obviously. But still, I think there had to be some sequential process to be developed. That also applied to some other countries who are interested in Europe too.
Kotani-san, there are a number of questions in the queue about Japan's strike capability. Maybe you can give us a quick update on where you think the debate is about what kind of strike capability, what the concept would be, how it affects roles and missions and capabilities between the US and Japan. Where's the strike policy going in Japan right now?
Well, I don't think we have reached any consensus on this issue yet. And our tentative solution is to expand our standoff missiles striking ranges. And there's people in Japan that we should possess strike capabilities to eliminate the incoming missile threat from both North Korea and China. And some people say that we should not have a capability to reach the Chinese mainland because that is too much escalatory. So for a moment, I don't think we can reach any consensus on this issue. But I think the standoff missile might be a starting point for us to possess those strike capabilities. And also, there will be a possibility that the US would request the deployment of US post-INF missiles on Japan. So if we ourselves possess the standoff missiles, that might open up the discussion on the introduction of US capabilities in Japan as well.
Thank you. Mireya, there's a question about Myanmar and whether the free and open part of free and open Indo-Pacific, which Japan added the free and open part, whether the U.S.-Japan alliance can pass this test, whether the U.S. and Japan are going to be able to demonstrate that we do both have the same approach, or maybe different tactics, but the same vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific when we have this really deplorable situation in Myanmar right now. What do you think?
It is a very difficult situation, and it's getting worse by the day. The levels of violence are escalating, and I think clearly for both the United States and Japan, this represents a serious challenge. Democracy promotion or democracy protection has been always a challenging topic for the allies, and Japan in the past has taken a different take of, the small d measures, and Japan has condemned the actions in Myanmar, but has not yet stepped up the way the United States has done with sanctions. There's a discussion in Japan about perhaps adopting something like the Magnitsky Act, but I don't think that there's any concrete action. And again, I don't have, because developments are unfolding as we speak, I don't have a clear answer as to whether the test will be passed or not, but it's a clear concern. I think it feeds into a broader trend in the region about democratic recession, that people now question us, our ability of the United States to speak on those issues because of our own struggles. And I believe that our own struggles actually make us more determined, not as the shiny city in the hill, but actually as part of our own ongoing struggle. And my last point I would make is that what really makes the US-Japan alliance durable is the shared commitment to democratic values. The test is then how we address these regrettable developments in Myanmar. So I don't have a strong, definite answer because I don't think it's possible yet.
So I'm going to ask Ambassador Sasae to have the last word. If you want to address Myanmar and democracy, please do. There are a lot of questions about Japan-Korea relations. So, in 1 minute, how do you solve Myanmar and Japan-Korea relations? Whatever hopeful signs you can give us before we end.
Yeah, I think the goal, Japan shares together with the United States, that the restoration of democracy, obviously, and what the military, regime tried to do is inconsistent with our goal. That's why I think we are against it. We hope that they would peacefully transfer the power to the civilian regime of the Third. The question, this was repeated several times in the past. There was also sanctioned by Western part, US and Europe. And at the end, you might think that because of the pressure that worked, and then and then there was a transition of power to Aung San Suu Kyi. But we all knew that that was done with the arrangement that military was still continue to be in the major power place. And so the question is that while we are putting pressure and working, try to have some negotiated solutions between Suu Kyi and the military regime. In doing so, we can't really cut the channel of talk and dialogue with even military regime, even if you don't like it. And often the case we had to talk and get them on board. And in doing so, there has to be not only the sanction, there has to be proper sort of assurance that they'll be part of the power sharing regime, which is very democratic. And that happened in some other countries too over the process. So we can't, how do you do it? That's a part of the negotiated process. The question, would the United States be able to intervene and negotiate between the two? The answer is no, possibly, because the military government is difficult to do so. That's where a country like ASEAN, especially led by Indonesia, could work. And also we could work and tell the military government what you guys need to do while we are expressing our displeasure and try to bridge over some of the difficulties. And that's the way it should be. So the United States would continue to play a vital role as the vanguard of democracy. That's great, and we need the pressure. But if all the other countries would simply give the pressure and criticize, they don't come out for the talk. So they will continue to be there and put themselves in their own place and seeking the support from China. And China don't say anything. That China will continue to be a good guy to military regime. So all these things are not necessarily what we are wishing for. So there has to be some balance between all this pressure and how we would communicate to them.
Thank you. We're out of time, and we didn't solve the Japan-Korea relationship, nor could we have. In our closed discussion, we spent a lot of time on this. I think it's fair to summarize it by saying that there was a complete unanimity on the U.S. side that strengthened U.S.-Japan-Korea relations are critical. This is also a test as we face North Korea and Chinese hegemonic ambitions. And there was a pretty strong consensus on the Japanese side that was right, and that it's really, really politically difficult. So I think the challenge for the Biden administration is to find, creative and strategic ways to build an agenda trilaterally. As Ambassador Sasae said, there's already been a trilateral meeting to focus on North Korea, and I hope more will follow. It's been a great discussion. I think we've really captured the zeitgeist of the alliance right now and addressed many of the agenda items that Foreign Minister Motegi and Ambassador Sung Kim put out at the beginning. So thank you all on the panel, and thank you everyone from London to Tokyo for joining us. And we look forward to next year when our alliance is even stronger. Thank you.